This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hello, friends. I'm Tim O'Brien. Chances are, if you went to college, in order to get admitted, you had to submit your high school transcripts. And maybe you completed an essay with your application, and you had to share the results of your SAT and ACT scores. Almost anyone who's applied for college knows just how important those test scores have been to get into the college you wanted. But in recent years, there's been a movement to deprioritize those test results as a measure of student potential. Is this right? Is this fair? Those are two questions we're going to talk about with our guest today. Meanwhile, before we get started, if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening, wherever you're listening, give us a good rating and review. Today, we're joined by April Bleske-Rechek. She co-authored an article recently in Skeptic Magazine where she makes the case that standardized college admissions tests are not biased. She says that they are, in fact, more fair than other measures to gauge student potential. April is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, where she focuses on individual differences in evolutionary psychology. She has written for many peer-reviewed journals, and she's an active member of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. April, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I really enjoyed your article. I found it refreshing in a way because, we anybody who's gone to college or even had kids that had to take the SAT score and ACT score, and they go to classes and they study, and it is so emphasized. And then all of a sudden one day, some people are saying that's not important. Yet even with my own two kids, I have seen that how they did on standardized tests did actually help us figure out if they were better, let's say by category, reading versus math or science. You could sort of tell by those standardized test scores. So that seems to be common sense, but your article lays it all out into 4 different areas. And I wanted to find out, before we even got started, why did you write the article?
Well, that's a hard question because you mentioned to me that you were curious about why I wrote the article. And I was looking back, trying to think about what was going on a year ago. And I think if I remember correctly, I have a colleague, Dan Robinson, who I have been in correspondence with for some time and done a little bit of collaborating with. And he contacted me because he had a request about, do you know anybody who'd be interested in writing about standardized testing? And I want to say it was he, and then asking me to join him. And in the end, I kind of took the lead on this project. And I think perhaps there are a number of reasons why I would want to do this. One reason was the outlet. This is Skeptic. So it's, it's written for the broad public, but actually I think more an educated public, a curious audience. And I wanted to write something that would address so many of the misconceptions about testing that are out there, and provide references to like the best studies that are out there that really, that tell the story of what's going on with testing. This is an issue. There is research to suggest this. Students don't get information about testing in their education. Like college, if you look at college textbooks, they don't get quality information about intelligence, models of intelligence, how we even measure intelligence, standardized tests, that would be even like secondary to me talking about intelligence. There's just so little information for the general public out there about this issue. So I wanted to put it out there. And of course it's controversial too, which makes it hard. But I thought on principle I should do it.
Since you wrote this article and maybe have spoken out on this issue, what has the reaction been for you in general?
I I have received some positive feedback. Like I've received emails like, "Hey, I saw your article. I really enjoyed that." Um, I actually used it. It had just it I We had just finished that article, and I used it in one of my courses in conjunction with an article by Paul Sackett and colleagues from the American Psychologist on high stakes testing. And I didn't want to use it by itself because it's kind of a summary piece, and the high stakes testing article by Sackett and colleagues is kind of it is kind of a piece that puts a lot of things together, but it's more technical. I wanted them to have like a less technical side that told a little bit more in terms of like what let's be upfront about this. What are people concerned about, right? And I was happy that the students found it really digestible. They said they liked that article more than the technical piece, which I wasn't surprised by, but at least it served its purpose. So they were positive. But then again, when people are negative about an article, they often don't tell you unless they want to take it apart piece by piece by piece. You don't get, uh, I don't think, the negative feedback necessarily. So I probably have selective feedback coming my way.
So that's a funny thing when you talk about feedback, because I mean, I mentioned to you before we got started, I'm in the public relations business, and we're always putting content out into the public. And it seems like a lot of times you put things out there that you're really proud of, and you don't get feedback, but you seem to always get feedback if someone doesn't like it.
Oh,
So that's almost a guaranteed if they want to do that. But now getting to the issue, I guess at the center of your article, and I know you can't speak for people who are behind the whole de-emphasis on standardized test scores, but to your knowledge, or to your perspective, what do you think is the motivation behind why people are trying to deprioritize standardized test scores?
I think what it really boils down to is there are individual differences and group differences on tests. And these test scores are correlated with valued life outcomes. And that really is a frustrating finding, right? And the fact that especially the group differences, right? The group differences are really alarming for people. And, in some of my research, I study sex differences. And when we talk about sex differences and representation of males versus females at higher ends of the distribution in mathematical reasoning, right? Or mechanical reasoning, as opposed to verbal ability, uh, that can be really uncomfortable for people. And the racial and ethnic group differences are robust, and they're consistent, and it would be easier, right? If we didn't have the test scores operating in admission policies, then the idea is that then those group differences in representation, particularly at elite institutions, would be diminished. And of course, we argue that that's not necessarily the case, right, for any number of reasons. But the point I'm trying to make is that the motivation is well intentioned. These are positive intentions, right? And test scores scare people because people are afraid of how they'll be used. There are misconceptions, right? There's the correlation, there's the correlation causation issue that when you have a difference, it doesn't mean that you know why the difference exists, right? Like, and that is so when people see group differences in test scores, they make an assumption about why that difference exists. And so that's just a logical fallacy in reasoning about any difference, either a sex difference or a race and ethnic difference. But there's also the probabilistic component that people, if they think about a test score and they see a test score difference, then they think that means that there's an eventual outcome that is determined by that difference in test score. And so they don't think about it probabilistically. So there's a statistical fallacy there. And then at the same time, on the other side, another statistical error happens, which is people see a correlation between an SAT score and college graduation rates. And it's not perfect, right? It's a moderate to strong correlation depending upon what you look at in terms of your college outcome or graduate school outcome. Some of them can be strong actually, but some of them are moderate. And people will say it's not a perfect correlation. There's so much noise in there, it doesn't do any good. And they don't, well, no correlation is perfect. And in fact, even if you have a correlation of like 0.3, that means I always check my numbers. But if you have a correlation of 0.3 out of, correlation runs from -1 to +1, correlation of 0.3, you're way above chance in terms of if you have two candidates, the one that scores higher is like 66% of the time going to be the one that is more likely to actually graduate college or do well as their first year GPA. Like those odds are important. It's not, of course we don't have a perfect correlation. And of course it's not the full story, right? It's not deterministic, it's probabilistic, and it's not a perfect correlation. So there's anytime people are looking at this issue, and maybe this is why I really wanted to write the article, because teaching research methods for 20 years, if there's anything that gets people, it's reasoning about correlation versus causation and understanding probabilistic versus deterministic thinking. Flat out, right? And then, of course, there's I have this finding, I don't like it, so make it go away. There's the emotional reasoning component. All of those issues are just like in this topic all together, like blow it up.
Sure.
Right?
They definitely are. And it's like you said, an emotional issue. And I wanted to sort of go through the points that you make in the article because I thought you laid it out so clearly. You had 4 common issues that proponents of deprioritization make. Then you address them with a summary statement and then data and substantive argument. And one of the groups that is against standardized testing is the National Education Association, which is the teachers union. They say that most of us know that standardized tests are inaccurate, inequitable, and often ineffective at gauging what students actually know. And you say in the article, do they really know? Can we really assume that? And I think that's a valid question. Is like, we're assuming something based on what maybe someone said or somebody introduced this concept. It's kind of like when someone says, that's a great restaurant. Everybody knows it. How do you know everybody knows it?
Right,
So
right.
it's that same thing. And I'm going to be a cynic on my end. I'm not asking you to take this position, but as a person who's seen how the NEA sort of prioritizes its own issues, they look after the teacher's best interest. And if teachers are underperforming, and that shows up in standardized test results, that the kids aren't doing as well coming out of this school versus that school, or this class versus that class, that makes the teachers look less effective. And I can see that if you can eliminate that measurement, you're also eliminating a measure against the teachers. But have you heard any discussion of that?
Well, a couple of thoughts come to mind, and I don't know if they're direct responses. But one thing is that the children in our country who most need high quality teaching are the ones who are least likely to get it. Hands down, right? That probably makes sense. The second piece is that although I think what you're saying is relevant, there's research going back to the 60s with Coleman, a huge report, the Coleman report, that the best predictor of how students fare in school is the student, the individual potentials that they bring in to the classroom. The best predictor of one year to the next, like when Lee Jussum has some great research looking at children's performance from year to year, right? So how they did in math in 6th grade, their end of year standardized exam scores. The best predictor of how they do by the end of the next year is that 6th grade test score, right? And this research has been done in the context of teacher expectancies and teacher behaviors. And once you control for their performance in 6th grade math, teacher expectancies to the extent that they're off, right? Like they hold expectations or biases about their students, don't do a whole lot for predicting how they do in 7th grade. There's a little bit there, but like once you control for previous achievement, right, teacher expectancies aren't going a long ways. So that's just like one example to make the case that we know from national data the best predictor are the students. That said, right, every student needs high quality instruction, and the students who probably most need high quality instruction at the basic level of, say, learning to read, right, are probably the ones least likely to get it.
That's so true. Well, let's talk about those 4 areas because, again, I think it is so simple the way you argued it, and you pretty much covered the whole issue, which when you watch the debate over the issue, it's made complex. And I think you simplified that. So the first myth, I guess, or the first argument for banning or reducing the use of standardized test scores is this one. Admission tests are biased against historically disadvantaged and racial ethnic groups. So that's a common thing that we heard. Now, what you said in the article is there are racial, ethnic, average group differences in admission test scores, but those differences do not qualify as evidence that the tests are biased. So I wondered if you could elaborate on that.
Okay. Yeah, and this gets at this correlation causation issue that I raised before. People will say this all the time. And in fact, when you ask, I just read a paper, it was like a guest editorial in Intelligence, the journal Intelligence, just this past year. And Matzel, I think that's his name, Matzel surveyed students. So he offered a course in intelligence for like 8 or 9 years, and he would survey his students coming in. What do you know about intelligence? And are intelligence tests good? And I'm equating intelligence tests here with standardized tests, and they're not they're not the same thing, right? But the basic idea of testing students for their mental aptitude. And they would say, oh, well, they're biased. And so that's what everybody's heard, right? And if you have a group difference, if you have an average difference in test score, it doesn't mean that you know where the difference comes from. And in our article, we actually cite others. A very recent article by Jerry Coyne and Luana Maroja, which it's just a great piece. And they say, and I exactly agree. So I'll just quote this. The existence of group differences on standardized tests is well known. It's a disparity. It's a difference. And the cause of the difference is unknown. And that's what they say. What is not well understood is what causes the disparities. It could be genetic differences, societal issues such as poverty, past and present racism, cultural differences, poor access to educational opportunities, the interaction between genes and social environments, or a combination of all of the above, which is the most likely option, right? So disparity does not mean bias.
One of the things I've seen on this issue, on this particular sub-issue, I guess if the big issue is standardized test scores are overemphasized. Now, the sub-issue is this one, that the tests themselves are biased against disadvantaged people. And one of the solutions you see thrown out quite a bit is, why don't they just reword the tests? Why don't they just, yeah. And what is your response to that?
Well, it doesn't matter what test you use. The same group differences show up. And I think that's probably the more problematic piece. So the SAT and the ACT are highly correlated with how people do on nonverbal culture-free tests. I mean, every GRE item or SAT item has some content. They have been tested for cultural equivalency. ETS and the College Board, they go through, they want everybody to take their tests, right? So they're trying to meet stringent standards by showing that the content of their items is not biased. There's a statistical way of talking about bias, which we can go to in terms of the next claim, right? But the other issue is that these group differences show up on nonverbal tests. They show up on, digit span, like I give you a number, you repeat it back. I give you 2 numbers, you repeat it back. I give you 3 numbers, you repeat them back. I give you 4 numbers, you repeat them back. That's 4-digit span. If I give you backward digit span, it gets a lot harder. 1 number, repeat it back. 2 numbers, repeat them back backwards. 3 numbers, repeat them back backwards. Repeat them back. 4 numbers backwards. It's getting really hard, really fast. Group difference shows up on that as well. Like it's not like this the SAT is the only test where we see these group differences. And that again, I think is what raises the concern about either sweeping it under the rug if we can't do something to ameliorate it. And I understand that concern because there's concern about misuse. But ignorance is never a good solution when it comes to designing solutions.
Well, there's another way to look at that question, because we talked about disadvantaged people, but I know, and it's almost assumed now, when you look at test scores and you look at academics, who are the valedictorians, who are scoring the highest, if you do break it down into ethnic groups, certain groups like Asian students tend to do well. So I guess the other question would be, do the standardized test scores favor certain students like that?
Yeah. I think, this is one of those circumstances, and I'm glad you bring that up, right? Coleman Hughes and Glenn Lowry have talked about this issue. There are some group differences that we don't maybe talk about, or if when people talk about Asian students doing very well on these tests, they'll talk about that they have, been taking on the white essentialism. But they also, they'll talk about a cultural difference that Asian families really support, right? Academics, they put a lot of emphasis on it. And Coleman Hughes, and I remember listening to a podcast with him one time talking about how we don't talk about that with other groups. It's okay to talk about it with the Asian group, right? But when can't bring up culture as an explanation when it comes to black-white difference. So I don't know if you're familiar with that line of argument, but people take different approaches for handling how well Asian students do, and there are other cultural differences too, right? The maintenance of if you've seen the book by Melissa Kearney that's out, Two-Parent Privilege, across educational classes, education levels, right? The degree to which marriage before children happens in Asian groups is still high. That has changed quite a bit for white and black populations in this country. Could that have something to do with it? I don't know, maybe, right? Like that's one piece of the cultural context that could be relevant. But we talk about it there, maybe not talk about and talk about it in other groups.
I think what you're going back to your point earlier is you can't take one data point like that, married parents, and say that's correlation and causation. You can't take that one data point, like you said. It's a combination. I have a story. One of my sons, when he was in school, he had a close friend who was from another country, and he came here. And you talk about the culture, because his family, when the school year ended in June, his mother and dad had a whole curriculum for him throughout the summer. He was supposed to read so many books. He was supposed to, they had goals, and it was more strict than what the school district was. And he did very well. He ended up going to Harvard and as you would expect. But it goes back to what you said. And within that family unit, and again, he wasn't born in America, but he had that family unit that I wouldn't even say were supportive. They were sort of mandating, this is how you're going to be. And he lived up to those expectations.
And it goes without saying, right, that those types of families exist in all groups, right? They just may be more or less frequent in some than in others, right? Again, you have that probabilistic pattern. But either way, the idea is the possibility that there are cultural differences on average that are associated with group differences in test scores is plausible, right?
Mhm.
And if they're plausible in one direction, they could be plausible in the other direction, right? But when it's emotionally uncomfortable, we might leave it alone.
That's true. And so I that is one very sensitive issue, and I thought you deftly handled that. Now, the next thing that you tackled was this claim: standardized tests do not predict academic outcomes. So again, that goes back to correlation, causation.
Yeah.
Does that cause it? Now, here's what you said in the article: standardized tests do not, or standardized tests do predict academic outcomes, including academic performance and degree completion, and they predict with similar accuracy for all racial and ethnic groups. So, could you elaborate on that one?
Sure, sure. Okay, so if you're looking at the SAT, and so the best way to establish if a test is valid, right? Most people would argue, I think most psychometricians would argue, does it show predictive validity? So the way we know that a test is doing what it's supposed to do, or that it's measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, is that it correlates with outcomes that you expect it to be correlated with, right? So it's predicting outcomes. And the SAT and the ACT, they're nearly equivalent. They're only pretty much different in the degree to which they really have closer ties to the curriculum. But if you give somebody the SAT and you give somebody the ACT, their scores will be highly correlated. Those both are good predictors of college outcomes, right? And the GRE is a good predictor of graduate school outcomes. A little not quite as solid for any number of reasons that we could get into. But the SAT, if you look at national data, the SAT and college first year GPA correlations about 0.45, 0.47. Okay, so these are pretty nice correlations. Like when I try to explain this to my students, for me too, I think this is a good way of thinking about it. If you have a correlation of 0.4, okay, and you have two students who take the SAT, if the correlation is 0.4, and I mentioned it's around 0.45 to 0.47, if you add in high school GPA into the picture, you've got a correlation of 0.5. Okay, so there's a lot of intercorrelation between high school GPA and SAT scores, but SAT alone, 0.4 to 0.5, 0.4 to 0.45 or so. If you have a correlation of 0.4 and you have two students take the SAT, the student that scores higher 75% of the time will be the student with a higher GPA in college and the one who's more likely to graduate from college. Like that's as opposed to a 50-50, right? Like that's a big deal. That's a good sized correlation. And the argument that they're not biased against that the predictive validity is high for all racial ethnic groups is that it doesn't matter if this comparison that I make involves two white kids or two Black kids or two Asian kids or two Latino kids, right? The predictive validity is the same. The one with the higher score is the one that is more likely to do better in college. And that's just example, right? Like pretend, right? From this population of students, you nab two at random from the sample, right? What's the likelihood that the higher scoring one also ends up being the one to have a higher GPA in college and the one that's more likely to not drop out or to pass?
You throw out an issue in the paper, and I think it makes sense that people who will say, well, why don't we just use the GPA? Why do we need the test score? Because if the GPA in high school is a predictor of college, why not use that? Or, because like you said, the one with the highest test score also tends to have the higher GPA. So there is a correlation there. So what's your answer to that?
Yeah, I think they should be used in conjunction. I don't think the high school GPA alone is messy. And I think a lot of people in the schools would say that it's messy because of grade inflation. There's been a couple of recent analyses that came out. I can't think of the author, but there was one Sanchez maybe a few months ago looking at the increasing discrepancy between standardized achievement test scores, students' perceptions of their college readiness, and then their grades. So their grades continue to be high. Their perceptions of college readiness are high, and their college readiness scores are down, right? So there's a disjunction. Now, the tests haven't changed. Grading patterns have changed. We know that grading patterns have changed. Um, we can survey teachers, and we know their patterns have changed.
I think there's another issue because I experienced it myself. I wasn't the best student in high school. And it's one of those things where I was a great student in grade school. I always did well. I tested well, and I had fun in high school. So I didn't take high school as seriously as I should have, and I wanted to go to this particular school, which was a good school, and but I tested well. My SAT was high, and so the school wouldn't have given me the time of day based on my grades, but they interviewed me, and I got into this school, and I did well. Then I graduated pretty well at the school
Yeah.
at the college I
Yeah.
went to, and I told the guy the admissions counselor when I interviewed with him. I said, "Well, I'm serious now. I want to do this," and I was. I wasn't lying. And so the day I stepped onto that campus, I had one thought in mind. I was going to not only graduate, but I was going to graduate on time and make an achievement. I hoped, and that was my focus. And you call people like that late bloomers. You know,
Yeah.
but that test score for me was critical.
And that was,
Because
yeah. I'm so
so
glad you tell that story, because
what have you
standardized,
seen there?
thank you for reminding me of that, right? Like, a huge purpose of standardized tests initially was to catch the diamonds in the rough, right? Like, and it's not always late bloomers. It's also kids who are super talented and they're bored. They're in a school that's not offering academic opportunities that are really making it happen for them. And so some are, like you, they're just more intent on having fun in high school, but other kids have disconnected, right? Because they haven't had academic opportunities. And that standardized test is a way to reel them in, to be like, oh, wait, don't forget about these kids. I mean, not that we should forget about any kid, right? But they're not going to get noticed without that score.
And I think that's like you say, it's one data point. You look at transcripts, you look at their GPA, you look at how they did in one class versus another. You look at recommendation letters, you read essays, perhaps you interview them, and you also then have these scores to go by. So you have a lot of different dimensions to
Yeah.
look at for each student.
Okay, thinking about GPA, could I say one more thing? And that is that so Sackett, this is Paul Sackett at the University of Minnesota, has done an analysis, he and colleagues, looking at differences in terms of what courses students take, right? I think that's in college. They looked at the SAT as a predictor of freshman GPA as a function of what courses, like the rigor of the courses they take, right? And it's so every measure has noise. The high school GPA has noise because students take different types of courses, and college GPA is noisy because it has different types of courses, right? Students take more or less rigorous programs. And that's one of the appeals of a standardized test. So another area of research of interest for me is advanced placement. And one of the reasons why I think the advanced placement program is so awesome is, one, it provides intellectual challenge for students. But another reason is that although the tests aren't as, say, standardized as say the SAT, they go through changes every year but all the students take the exact same test, right? So like when you have AP US history, all 360,000 students across the US, or however many it is, who take that test each year, they're taking the same exact test on the same day at the same time, right? Standardized. And the scoring process is as standardized as it can be, right? All the readers are trained on a rubric every year, fresh rubric every year for this set of questions. And then as they're scoring, there are validity checks running through the system. Everybody's still on rubric. Everybody gets the same little like it's like a, what do you call that? A shopper who comes in and poses as a shopper, the secret
Oh,
shopper,
yeah.
secret
Secret
shopper.
shopper.
They have like secret exams running through the system to make sure that everybody's still on rubric and still scoring according to plan. It's a standard system. Everybody's being evaluated on the same playing field. That's fair.
And when you have a standard test, the way it's controlled that way, because nowadays we have to worry about cell phones and people do things with, I mean, they have, I wouldn't necessarily say cheating, but they have ways of getting a little bit of help while they're taking certain tests. And that eliminates all that because you have someone carefully watching that nobody is using anything that could help them take the test. The third thing that you talked about, and I'll read that claim, is this: standardized tests are just indicators of wealth or access to test preparation courses. Now, here's your response to that. You say that standardized tests were designed to detect sometimes untapped academic potential, which is very useful for and controlling for wealth and privilege, does not detract from their utility. Now, you kind of just got at that when you were talking about the whole issue of identifying that untapped academic potential, but you didn't talk about that wealth and privilege issue so much.
Yeah.
So how would you address that?
Yeah. And I think this also too reminds me of that basic idea that these standardized tests are measuring, they're predictive, right? So when people say, oh, they don't measure what you know, that's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to measure your likelihood of doing well and learning new information, right? They're essentially measuring your aptitude and potential to acquire information and skills. Which is probably one of the reasons why coaching is only so effective. So a lot of people will say, oh, it's just a wealth test, right? The students do well because they're come from a wealthy family. And it is true that students, so social class is positively correlated with scores on the SAT or ACT. The correlation actually isn't as strong as you would expect. It's about 0.3. But correlation does not mean causation. So when you look at within each level of social class, the predictive validity of the SAT is the same. So you can look at students within low social class. The predictive validity of their score predicts how well they do. Another way of saying this is, right, and you could do that at the middle social class, you do the upper social class, right? Differences in SAT still predict how you do in college. So again, I guess another way of saying this is that when you hold social class constant, the SAT is still just as good of a predictor of college performance as it was before controlling for social class. The other piece about coaching and training is that we know this for the LSAT, we know this for the GRE, we know this for the SAT. Programs will advertise, we can boost your score by X amount, right? But that is the maximum that they've achieved. And the average growth for taking a course is small. And it's about the same as you would get if you, as a self-disciplined student, engaged in some like you go to the library, you get the book, you go through the problems, you do a practice test for a few weekends in a row, boom, you just took the coaching class that your parents could have forked out $1,000 for. You can do the coaching on your own. And now for the ACT, all of my local high schools, and I don't live in an elite context by any means, all of our local high schools, ACT prep, mandatory. It's mandatory, right? So and I'm not saying it's mandatory in every school, but I'm guessing that it is offered and at least offered and mandatory in many, to try to sidestep that possibility of a wealth advantage. That is a well-intentioned effort, and I think it's a good effort. But that said, like coaching courses, if you have students who won't do, like if I have an undergrad, right, who wants to do really well on the GRE, and I'm worried about them engaging in the self-discipline practice of going through practice problems and practice tests on their own, I'll say sign up for a class, because then it's in your schedule and you have to go and you
Right.
put the money in and now you're going to do it. And that seems rational to me.
I think that's key, because to me, whether it's a book or a course, however you do it, it may not teach you how to answer the questions, but what it does is it gets you over that test anxiety, because when you walk into that room to take the test, you already know you don't need to necessarily read the directions like you would for the first time and be overwhelmed by the process. So it gets you accustomed to the process, so it's not totally new to you when you walk into that room.
Yeah.
But there is one thing that you mentioned on this point, is that if you would take away the standardized test, and if the issue was wealth and privilege, you actually are reintroducing that. It's a counterintuitive point, because you take away a standardized test, which is equality, and you now have people who are getting grades possibly because their father or mother donate to the private school, or because they're just connected and they can have sway even in a public school. Maybe their parents know the school board, or any number of things could happen, but they have influence. So you are reintroducing subjective judgments on students, and it still can hurt those underprivileged students that aren't wealthy and aren't as privileged. Isn't that what you said in the article?
Yeah. And I think that was if I'm think about where you're going with this, the fourth claim, right, was the idea that admissions decisions would be more fair without standardized tests, and we argued that no, actually they would be less fair, because you would be relying on, well, not only you wouldn't be solving the problem, because the other elements that go into the application process, right, have those same discrepancies, those same group disparities that standardized tests do, but that you'd be introducing more subjectivity into the equation and more room for bias. And it feels more human to people, which I think we like, right? But it's also room for bias and error. So I just read a report, like it just came out, on essays, personal essays, and they correlate more highly with social class than SAT scores do. This makes sense. What people write about, the topics they write about, are relevant to their class. Their use of language and punctuation and grammar and stylistic approaches, one could be amenable to having the money to have somebody help you write it, having parents who have the time to edit your work, and who are cognitively able and educated enough to do that. And they write about, things like violin lessons, and you know what I mean? They're writing about things that are more associated with being in an upper class environment. They may be talking about overcoming challenges, but the challenges are a different type of challenge, right? And they're correlated with social class. So you take out the standardized measure that I would argue is fair, and you're introducing more subjectivity and things that are associated with social class.
So much more. And that third question, that last point I asked, did bleed over into the fourth point. So I will read that, because it just covers what you just said, and then leads into some other questions that I had.
Okay.
Admission decisions are fairer without standardized tests. That's something that people who are against standardized tests think, that it's just more fair not to have standardized tests. And you said the admissions process will be less useful and more unfair if standardized tests are not used. And that's pretty much what you said. And I think you get at this too. One of the issues that's happening when certain schools are relying less on standardized tests is because they are struggling financially. And in order to get more students, they are lowering their standards, their admission requirements, and they're not necessarily worried about that student graduating. They want to get that freshman year tuition and maybe the sophomore year and take it from there. But they want to get a higher volume of students coming in So they lower their standards. And one way of doing that is through the test scores. Another point you make is that bigger schools, maybe not private schools, maybe not elite schools, but larger schools that can handle the volume, they make more money by attracting more students. So it's all about volume and numbers, and not necessarily picking students who are promising or will even graduate from college. So those are the points you make. How much do you see that from your perspective in the academic world?
Well, I think particularly at the graduate level, I think this is a concern. So for the GRE, for example, and it's probably relevant for the SAT. I think I'm more have more information recent relative to the GRE, but the general record examination, or the graduate record examination general, and then the graduate record examination, you have subject tests. And I even had a conversation at my own university for a master's program. And I said, okay, now you're still going to offer the GRE, right? And they were like, no, because all of our sister institutions that we compete with to get students have taken out the GRE. So if we do, students aren't going to apply, because they can apply to all these other institutions that they don't have to submit their GRE score. And I'm guessing that the same logic applies. Like, we know at Madison, when Madison went test optional during COVID, they had so many more applicants, and most of the smaller institutions, I'm a public of which I am one, right? Like, there's Madison, Milwaukee, and then 11 others. And most of the universities besides Madison lost students, because we were all competing for the limited number who didn't apply to Madison, not having to submit test scores. And Madison over-enrolled and ended up not having housing for thousands of students. So I think this is a legitimate issue, right? And we also know from other studies that students who submit their scores have higher scores than students who don't.
That's very interesting. So you said that students who have higher scores will submit them, and those that don't, obviously, downplay it. So that is consistent. I have one more question for you, and I wanted to bring up a slide because I think you really put it in layman's terms here when you describe what this issue is. So this is from your article. You said, quote, "If scientists were to find that a medical condition is more common in one group than another, would they not automatically presume that the diagnostic test is invalid or biased?" So, in other words, we're talking about the issue of testing, whether it's academic or medical or whatever. Would you look at any other type of test and say, well, we don't want to know that? And your point there is, don't shoot the messenger, which I think that's what it is. The tests are telling you something. Do you get rid of the test because it's telling you something you don't want to hear?
Yeah. We don't want to. It's something we don't want to hear, but it means that we have work to do, right? And by the way, I guess I think I would attribute that quote to Dan Robinson. I'm pretty sure he came up with that example, and I thought it was so clever. It's true, right? Like, if we have a medical test and it's showing that we're seeing this diagnosis in one group more than another, we wouldn't make the test go away. We'd probe and say, what's going on here? Let's find all the potential causes and try to get at them, instead of shooting the messenger. Yeah. So crazy.
I said I had one more question, but I have one more to follow it. If we're talking about root causes, and I think you can't solve the world's problems, but it sounds like this whole issue could be improved if some of the root causes were addressed. In other words, if we know there's cultural issues, if we know there's so many other issues, what can the system do to take into account those things to make sure that the people that are underprivileged have a better chance without getting rid of standardized tests?
Yeah. Like, what do I think we can do?
Yes.
I think early education and a consistent and sustained effort very early on to improve the educational, nutritional, family cultural environments that children are in. And we know, I don't know if you've seen the recent podcast, Sold a Story, about the wars, the science wars on reading, the reading wars as they're called. But there's a lot of research to suggest over the past several decades that a lot of our kids who really need solid instruction in reading, those who may, about a third of students learn to read pretty naturally, like they don't need explicit supports. But 2/3, we don't learn to read the way we learn to talk, right? Like we're verbal creatures, and lovely thing about being human, but reading and writing don't come naturally. And about a third with basic instruction get it pretty quickly, and 2/3 don't. And they need really good instruction. And that is such a foundational skill for everything.
April, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
To learn more about all that we talked about here, please see our episode page at shapingopinion.com. Make sure to leave a rating and review and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Want to connect? Check out our website, shapingopinion.com. Follow us on the X platform, Facebook or Instagram at Shaping Opinion. And make sure to join our Facebook group called Shaping Opinion Podcast Listeners. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2024.